Morning, everybody. I'm going to give a couple more minutes just to let some other people join, and then we will get started.
Excuse me.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Okay, we're going to make a start. So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for our capital procurement webinar. Apologies again that the session had to be rescheduled from last week, but hopefully everyone who was meant to attend last week is here today. My name is Marianne de Bond, and I am a Senior Programme Manager for SEUPB. We've got a really good session for you today on capital procurement. I'm delighted to introduce our hosts. So we have David McCarthy and Leon Poutsier, and they are both from Quantity Surveying Services, and they work in partnership with Arvo. So those who were at the general procurement session last week will know Mike from Arvo presented, and Leon and David work in partnership with Arvo and consult on the capital side of their work. So you're going to be in great hands today. I'm also delighted to introduce Emma Fallis, who I'm sure a lot of you know. Emma is our eligibility manager and a font of all knowledge here at SEUPB. So again, between the three of them, you are in very good hands today. The process for the webinar, we will have a presentation from our three hosts, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end where you'll be able to ask specific questions about your project. Myself and my colleague Fanula will be running the Q&A, so please do submit your questions and I will then put them to the panel once the presentation is finished. Just to let you know, this session will be recorded and will be available via our support portal after the session is over. We will also be sharing the slide deck with you as well, so that will come out to you in an email this afternoon. I will also send you out a feedback form for the session, and it would be great to hear your opinion on the session. We're trying to make these sessions as useful and relevant as possible, so any feedback that you have for us would be great. So you will receive all of that after the session. But without further ado, I will hand you over to our expert panel, and I'll see you back here for the Q&A session.
Good morning, everybody. So we're just going to take a run through of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to first of all look at just an overview of what the PEACEPLUS programme is, looking then at the different regulations in relation to procurement, looking at the default position that all projects have to adhere to for procurement, the EU thresholds, public procurement red flags, breaches of procurement rules and penalties, modification contracts, how you can do that within an eligible manner, use of contingency. We also then will look at some case studies then, overview, sort of looking at how to modify your contracts, and those will be focusing on public works contracts in Ireland. There then will be a summary of the main causes of contract modifications, some cost claims, dispute resolution options, and then, as Marianne already had said, the question and answer session then at the end. So the PEACEPLUS programme is a cross-border funding programme supported by the European Union, the Government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Government of Ireland and the Northern Ireland Executive. So the PEACEPLUS programme is a 1.14 billion programme, and it encompasses both Interreg and PEACE elements, and it's to continue the social and economic environmental development of Northern Ireland and the 6 border counties of Ireland, in support of peace, stability and stability in relation to the future perspective of the area. The programme is managed by the Special EU Programmes Body, and we have then the remit of managing these funds for the Northern Ireland and border counties. Once you get the slide deck, we also then, you'll be able to get these hyperlinks. There is then a link then to the programme manual and the overview document on the PEACEPLUS programme as well. So in relation to procurement, all projects who are in receipt of PEACEPLUS funding must comply with the relevant public procurement rules and legislation. So the public procurement rules are set out in 3 European directives, and these then have been transposed into national legislation and apply to all tenders and contracts above certain thresholds. So 3 different European directives are the one on general public procurement, which is goods, supplies and works, which is the regulation 2014-24. There then is also one in relation to the utility sector, and it's regulation 2014-25. And then there also then is another regulation in relation to the award of concessionary contracts, and that's 2014-23. The text on the screen then in red is then where those European regulations have been transposed into Irish law. In relation to Northern Ireland and the UK procurement, prior to Brexit, the EU directives were transposed into UK law in the form of the Public Contracts Regulation 2015, the Utilities Contracts Regulation 2016, and the Concessions Regulation 2016. After Brexit, these laws continue to be applied to any contracts that were let prior to the 24th of February 2025. Then on the 24th of February 2025, the above laws then were replaced by the Procurement Act 2023, which diverges from the EU directives on public procurement. But one of the things we have to note to partners is that if you're in receipt of PEACEPLUS funding, you must comply with the EU public procurement directives. So as previously said, the default position for the PEACEPLUS programme is that all procurement should be undertaken on a cross-border basis. That means that all tenders must be advertised in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. In our previous seminar that we had delivered, Marianne mentioned earlier on, it was about general procurement, and we would have touched on all the thresholds. But as the seminar relates to capital procurement, we're just going to highlight the higher value thresholds. So up until March 25, the the regulation had stated that contracts above 30,000, that limit now has been increased now to 50,000. So if your contract is between 50,000 and the EU threshold, you have to advertise your contract in the regional press on a cross-border basis, or you can use the public procurement websites, and that is etenders.gov.ie and then eTenders Northern Ireland or eSourcing NI. One of the things to note is that you can voluntarily advertise a contract in the official journal, and that actually will comply with the cross-border requirements of advertising in both jurisdictions. The only exemption to this is where your project actually operates in a single jurisdiction, and that's where that your project only has one partner in the jurisdiction, and that the activities only take place in only one jurisdiction as well. So if you have any queries regarding if your project is operating on a single jurisdiction, I advise you to make contact with your JS case officer for clarification. So these are the EU thresholds that are applicable that you're supposed to be aware of when you're dealing with capital projects. There's different thresholds then for supplies and services, and then from works. So if your organisation is either a government department or one of its offices, you'd notice that then the threshold for supplies and services is 143,000, whereas for works it's 5.5 million. If you're a public sector organisation, so that's outside the civil service, that's the local and regional authorities, the threshold is 221,000. And then for utility sector, the threshold is 443,000. So if your contract is valued above any of those thresholds, you must advertise your contract opportunity on the official journal of the European Union. One of the things to note for Northern Ireland contracting authorities is that if you advertise your contract on find a tender service, it isn't actually compliant with the EU. So you have to make sure that you actually have to advertise these high value contracts on the official journal. Again, contracts between 50,000 and the EU threshold, we're just a reminder that full tender action is required. The tender must be advertised on a cross-border basis using national procurement websites or the regional press. And then in these cases, the tender doesn't have to be advertised in the official journal, but you can voluntarily, if you wish, to meet the cross-border requirements. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues.
Thank you, Emma, and good morning to everyone. Following on from Emma's introduction there to the EU and the PEACEPLUS procurement requirements and the default tender procedures that have to be respected, it is also important to be aware that there are certain red flags in the procurement process that may indicate potential risks of irregularities or corruption or wrongdoing. And these are tabled under 5 main headings. So the first one there is rig specification. And as the heading would suggest, this relates to various anomalies in the specification of the product or the services that are being sought, and which could be that the specification is unusual or unreasonable. Brand names are used rather than generic descriptions, although using brand names is also a very common mistake that we notice are made by design consultants on most capital projects. Or the winning bidder's product is very similar to the product specification. Again, this is also a common mistake that design consultants do make when they simply download technical specifications online and then attempt to make it generic in appearance. The second heading then would be collusive bidding, and this generally occurs when companies collude to manipulate bids or prices and thus undermine the fair competition, and is generally evident if all bidders provide very high tender bids and then they drop the tender bids if a new competition is launched and a new bidder is added to the competition. The third heading would be conflict of interest, and this basically arises when an individual has 2 different interests that overlap. In the context of public procurement, this would be a conflict between the public duties and private interest of a public official. As an example, a simple example, the spouse of a contracting authority's desk officer in charge for monitoring a tendering procedure works for one of the bidders. Now, the European Commission Anti-Fraud Office has also published a practical guide for managers to identify conflicts of interest in public procurement procedures. And they include in that guide templates for declarations of an absence of conflict. And these are generally implemented by the public authorities. In Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Audit Office has published a very good practice guide for conflicts of interest. The fourth heading then would be manipulation of bids. And this is a clear indication of corrupt behavior and could include acts of disqualifying qualified bidders, not re-tendering when less than the minimum number of bids have been received, and bids are being voided for errors, etc. The final head then would be split purchasing, which involves dividing a larger purchase into two or more smaller purchases to avoid exceeding the thresholds for competitive bidding or other procedures. This would also be a red flag for potential fraud or corruption. Now, in respect of the red flags, it's always important to note that whilst these red flags can be considered good measures to signal potential corruption risks, they do not necessarily demonstrate or provide any definitive proof of the presence of corruption. We can move to the next slide. So we move on to breaches of procurement rules and penalties that can be imposed by the European Commission. So where expenditure is financed by the European Union, any non-compliance with or irregularities with the applicable rules on public procurement as set out in the EU directives, as have been listed previously in slides 4 and 5, there can be severe financial penalties imposed for such non-compliance. Now, the European Commission has formalized guidelines on the extent of these penalties, and these can be accessed on the link that is provided on the slide. Now, the most common breaches of procurement rules would be for inadequate advertising, as described in the previous slides, authorities accepting late tender submissions, the procurement team amends or introduces new selection criteria or award criteria, the contract notices are not published and the award notices are not published on the official journal of the European Union, and modification of contracts beyond the approved limits. Now, the PEACEPLUS program manual also provides some further guidance under section 6.5 in this regard. It should be noted that the lead partner in any project is always responsible for ensuring compliance with the national and the EU procurement rules. Emma will guide us through the next couple of slides just on the types of irregularities and the rates of correction or penalties that may be applied.
Thank you, Leon. Yes, so the types of irregularities, these actually have been taken from the guides that Leon referred to in the previous slide, and there is the link there. So they're broken up into different sections where you can result in a breach. So in relation to the publication and the tender specification, so if there's lack of publication or you've sought no seeking quotes, 100% of the contract could be deemed irregular. So you'll get no financial assistance with that. If there's been inadequate advertising, where the contract was advertised to some extent, but not fully. So for example, if the contract was above a threshold contract and it should have been advertised in the official journal, but it was only advertised on national press, you would get 25% penalty will be taking off that because you didn't abide by the procurement action that was required for the value of the contract. Artificial splitting of contracts to avoid publication, either bringing it below the different thresholds, 100% of the contract then can be deemed as being ineligible. If there's insufficient time for potential bidders to obtain tender documentation or restrictions in obtaining the tender documentation, basically barriers or obstacles put in the way of tenders bidding, you can have penalties that can range between 5% and 25%. If there's non-compliance with time limits for receipt of tenders, the penalties can range between 10 and 100%, depending on the seriousness of it. Failure to publish or sufficiently describe the selection and or award criteria, including the weightings, a 25% penalty can be applied for that. Using criteria which deters bidders, a 25% penalty can be applied as well. Or if the scope of the contract is insufficient or imprecise, basically the scope to a contract being unclear or potentially restricting competition, a 10% penalty can be applied. Moving on then now to the selection and evaluation of tenders, where the selection criteria was modified after the tenders were opened. So basically the assessment panel then evaluates the tender on other criteria that wasn't published or doesn't follow the criteria that was in the published tender specification, a 25% correction can be applied. Using criteria different than that stated in the specification or unpublished, the percentage is between 10 and 25%. If there's an insufficient audit trail, basically a lack of transparency in the justification of award, a 25% penalty, or if there is one of the partners refuses or the contracting authority refuses to provide the audit trail, 100% penalty can be applied because there is no then evidence to justify the award of the contract. If there's negotiation during the award process or the modification of a tender during the tender evaluation to favour a certain bidder, a 25% penalty can be applied to that. Irregular prior involvement of bidders attracts a 25% penalty. Procurement processes with negotiation where conditions of the contract or the scope have been then altered, again a 25% penalty. An unjustified rejection of abnormally low bids or tenders, a 25% penalty. And then conflict of interest, which Leon already mentioned as being a red flag. If that has an impact on the outcome of the procurement process, 100% penalty can be applied to the project. The final section that penalties can be applied on are in relation to the contract implication, that where the contract has been modified and it isn't in line with then the directive. So it's basically a 25% value of the initial contract plus then 100% then of the contract extension, depending on the circumstances.
Yes. So some of the concerns that SEUPB have highlighted specifically relate to the post-contract stage of the project or where modifications are made to the project. It should be noted that with good planning, a comprehensive, robust specification and a well-designed contract, the need for any contract modifications or additional works during the implementation stage should be minimized. As a general rule, if a contracting authority wants to purchase additional works, supplies, or services during the implementation of the contract, these supplementary tasks should be tendered under the EU and national procurement legislation. Now, the EU Public Procurement Directive 2014 under Article 72, which is headed as modification of contract during their term, does however provide for changes during the life of the contract. And we would set these out as follows under the following circumstances. So the first one there, the contract explicitly allows for modification. That's the contract's terms and conditions. And these conditions or provisions in the contract are clear, they're precise, and they are foreseeable. The second circumstance is where the additional works or services or supplies being provided by the original contractor and the change of contractor is not possible for economic or technical reasons. and the value of the modification does not exceed 50% of the contract value. The third one on the next slide. So the third circumstance is unforeseen circumstances that may arise that could not have been foreseen. This circumstance would not alter the overall nature of the contract, and it's generally limited to 50% of the original contract value. The fourth circumstance is where a contractor is replaced, and this may be due to the contractor restructuring or merging its business. This, however, should be checked by the authority to ensure that it is not being done to avoid any competition. And finally, where there are low value modifications that are generally associated with state aid provisions and wouldn't really implicate us on the capital project side. Now, the EU Commission, in their guidance document, Public Procurement, there's a link for it there, under section 5.3 provides further guidance on dealing with modifications. And the following 3 slides are extracted or are table 23 of that publication, and broadly sets out the Article 72 options and the relevant questions that the public authority should ask themselves in respect of allowable changes before deciding a contract modification. We aren't going to go through these in detail, but they are there in the guidance notes. So if we move on to slide 18, and the PEACEPLUS rules in relation to modifications or variations and the funding of these from the construction contingency. Now, generally, variations in construction often come from client changes, design adjustments, or unexpected site conditions. And if not managed well, these can cause delays and cause further cost overruns. To reduce the impact, contracts should outline exactly how the variations will be handled, managed, and administered. So planning for design changes, budget limits, material availability, and regulatory updates early during the procurement phase helps keep projects on track. So at the construction stage, the optimum buyer's contingency sum is intended to cover the cost of the unforeseeable works. They should not be used for variations or extra work beyond those agreed in the contract as being essential to delivery of the project. Obviously, we have to consider these. The SEUPB will consider these, the appropriateness of the expenditure and the use of the contingency sums, and will generally assess, is the work essential? Whether the quality proposed is essential, whether there are any means to reduce the level of additional cost, example, by varying specification to reduce other costs and other work elements. Was the work foreseeable, i.e. should it have been included within the original contract? If it should have been included in the original contract, it is not a contingent, it will not be considered a contingency item, and it will not be eligible for reimbursement from the program. Now, there may be some circumstances when it is deemed that the work is not essential for the delivery of the funded program, but the grantee wishes to proceed with these additional works. And in these instances, the grantee may be permitted to proceed as long as they provide the additional funding from their own sources. I think we hand over to Dave McCarthy for the case study element of the presentation.
Thank you, Leon and Emma. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here today. I'm going to give a heads up warning. I'm obviously, from my accent, I'm from Cork. So if I speak too quickly, please, someone just ask me to slow down. It's an inherent problem here. I'm looking at specifically compensation events. Okay, back in the early 2000s, there was the M50 built in Dublin. There was also the Port Tunnel. Okay, and they went hugely over budget. And at that time, it was recognised that there was a requirement for government contracts. Previously, they would have used FIDIC, which is a well-known international contract, very workable. They would have also used the IEI form of contract. These are all forms of contract that were fine in their day, but when it came down to transparency and trying to monitor, it didn't work, and that was reflected in these two projects that went hugely over budget. Okay, so on that basis, around 2008, the Irish government brought in the Capital Works Management Framework. And this was, it was a collaboration between contractors in some cases and various authorities, consultants, etc. And they would have had looked at what they saw as being the least risk that can be applied on an employer, and that's transferred over to a contractor. These contracts are quite onerous. Now, the likes of myself and Leon, we would act for contractors and employers. We have seen the problems with these contracts. We act on both sides in different jurisdictions here, the UK and beyond. And we have seen the difficulties for employers trying to monitor, trying to control, trying to mitigate. So I think it's worth listening to what we have to say, because we've experienced this. We've been writing claims for 30 years on these, or defending. This Capital Works Management Framework was set out in 4 pillars. You had the main public works contracts, and there are 6 different forms of contract, which we'll discuss a little later. Pillar 2 is then their standard conditions of engagement. Again, standard appointment terms and conditions for consultants, employers' representatives, conciliators, etc. Standard wording, all very consistent with Pillar 1. Pillar 3, cost planning and control suitability assessment. Very good worksheets on there. They're readily available. You click on the web page, they are available. They allow you to estimate, look at feasibility, work it right through to final account stage. All the time monitoring costs, seeing how far you are within budget, or if you're coming close to the budget or above it. So it's early warning. It's a very, very good process. Okay, and they are very, very useful tools to have, and they're there in Excel ready for you to use. Pillar number 4, guidance notes. Very, very extensive. One of the documents is 1,500 pages. It is a step-by-step guide of how to use these forms of contracts. They're called the PWC, the Public Works Contracts. Simple name, but that's what they are. Okay. Those contracts were brought out, as I say, specifically to reduce the risks to employers, to try and control the expenditure, to try and control the program durations. Okay. The most notable attributes that I see in this contract is, number 1, background information. You're giving, you can give, as the employer, you can give as much background information as you want under the tender, as part of the tender documents. Site investigation, historical maps, as-bills, services, surveys, etc. You can provide all of those with no liability. Whether they're correct, incomplete, late, dated, it makes no difference. You hand them over to the contractor, he may rely upon them, you have no liability. That is a really strong point on the side of an employer, a nightmare for contractors. Okay, there are contractors in Ireland that will not tender these contracts because of that clause specifically, but it does give you a lot of strength as an employer. Okay, the second sort of attribute that I like about it is the fact that any claims, any compensation events raised by a contractor on these projects has to be preceded by a condition precedent. They must notify within a certain number of days, and they must provide substantiation within a further number of days. If they don't do that, they waive their rights to any entitlements. The employer has then no liability, it falls away. So even if they were instructed to do an additional €1 million worth of work on a project, if they don't notify in time, even if the work's completed, drawings are shooted and signed off on, if you do not notify that it has a time impact and a cost impact, you as the contractor have no entitlement. So again, it's a very, very strong clause that supports the employer's risk control. The third point is that there are very clear methods of evaluation for variations. We call them compensation events, call them what you will. Very clear rules of evaluation. Also, the bills of quantities have to be prepared in accordance with standard methods of measurement. So again, there's a structure to the document. There's the opportunity of the employer to ensure these documents are aligned and that they are consistent and that they're protecting against over expenditure. Okay. And finally, an attribute that is also very helpful to the employer is that the contract documents are specifically set out on what is to be included under these contracts. They're given in an order of precedence. In the event that there are an inconsistency between these documents, the way forward is the one that's higher on the order in the order of precedence. So if you have, for example, drawings that have an error in them, or they're inconsistent with perhaps tender clarifications which are higher up the line in the order of precedence, whatever is in the higher order, that's what takes precedence, and that's what you have to construct as a contractor. So again, as the employer, you have huge control over that at tender stage. Okay, next slide, please, Emma.
Just before we go on, Dave,
Yes.
just would you actually just maybe sort of talk to, because we're aware that we have contract authorities who are from Northern Ireland on the call as well, and the fact is that the case studies we're going through today are related to sort of in Ireland, but the same principles apply to all contracting authorities when it comes to capital projects. So if you would
That's
just
correct,
mind maybe
that's
talking
correct,
to
and
that
that's
as well.
actually in my next. That's the point out. Absolutely correct. Now, you will note as we come down a little later that there are 21 compensation events on the public works contracts that are allowed. They're pretty well back to back with the NEC. So there's a lot of similarities between the NEC 4 and we would use both. So between the NEC 4 and what we call the PWC being the public works contracts in Ireland. Okay. Now, under the public works contracts, there are 6 forms of contract in the suite of documents. There's the short form, which is for contracts up to a value of €1 million. Okay, I've rarely seen it used. Very, very rarely I've seen it used. Then you have contracts between $1 million and up to $5 million, be they building or civil engineering, and that's called the minor works contract. And then you have the 4 main contracts that we would see used most often. You have the building works contract designed by the employer, the building works contract designed by the contractor, civil engineering works designed by the employer, and civil engineering works designed by the contractor. Those are the 4 main forms of contract that I see used, that are used of the 6 in the suite. Okay. Next slide, please, Emma. For the purpose of this, I'm ignoring the short form. It's used so rarely. I'm not referring to it. Okay. It's a very short form of contract. It's not really relevant to this. Okay. On the left-hand side of the column, you have PWCF 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are the public works contracts for the building and the civil engineering and the minor works. In all cases, the suite of documents require the following documents be included. That's on the column on the right-hand side. You must have a completed agreement, which is a standard format. Again, there's no unusual insertions. It is a standard document that makes it nice and comfortable for the employer. You have the letter of acceptance, which is an important document. The date on the letter of acceptance is a milestone in the contract for programming, etc. We don't need to get that in here today, but that's quite important. Attached to the letter of acceptance are any post-tender clarifications. So the contractor puts in his tender, there's subsequent negotiations, there's some inquiries made, and these are then recorded, and these form part of the contract. On occasion, these have been omitted. It's very, very difficult to get them inserted thereafter. It's important that when packing these contracts together, packaging them up, that everything is included. So you have the agreement, the letter accepted with the tender and clarification included. You have the form of tender, which is the document the contractor fills out when he's saying this will cost 10 million, my offer is 10 million, etc. And you have a schedule attached to it. I will come to the schedule later because that's quite an important document. The 4th item are the actual contract conditions. The 5th are the works requirements, which is the work scope. You have then a pricing document, which is a bill of quantities to any of us quantity swearers, and you have the works proposals. Now, these are listed as they are listed under the contract clause 1.3. This is the order of precedence. In the event that, for example, item 5, the works requirements, something is shown on a drawing there that conflicts with the post-tender clarifications, item 2. What's the post-tender clarifications takes precedence. Okay. In all of these contracts, there is what they call an entire agreement clause. The contract is confined to these documents. You cannot rely in previous discussions during the tender period. You can only rely on these documents. So that again gives the employer comfort. He knows what he signed up to with the contractor and he's in control of it. Okay, next page, please. Okay, the schedule is a major part of the contract, the public works contract. For those who are familiar with NEC 4, it's very, very similar to contract data part 1 and part 2. It gives information on who the point of contact is, liquidated damages, substantial completion dates, specialist contractors, and it's in 3 parts. Okay, the first part is filled out by the employer as part of the tender document, and in there he puts in his point of contact, what the LADs will be, a substantial completion, etc. That's there. So when it is being tendered, the contractor is aware of this information. The tender completes part 2, and again he inserts there what he believes are what will be his point of contact, the daily rate for any delays that he incurs that he can claim, and other pricing information is also in there. Part 3 is only concluded when the contract has been awarded, and that sets out the ADR, the means of alternative dispute resolution, be it conciliation, mediation, arbitration, and also points the standing conciliator. So quite an important document. But the most important feature of the schedule is that it lists out the 21 compensation events under which contractors can claim variations for time and money. Okay, they are very, very similar to the 21 that are included under NEC 4, almost back to back. In some cases, described almost directly the same. So there certainly was a bit of alignment with NEC when these contracts were being put together. The difference here is that under NEC, when you talk about a compensation event, it allows for time and money. Whereas on the government contracts, the public work contracts, PWCs, a compensation event and delay event are 2 different items. Okay, they're 2 different events. Of the 21 that we're going to look at here, some of them allow you compensation, some of them allow you delay. If you look at the schedule, sorry, the next page, apologies, the next page, apologies. Okay, so here you see on the first column, the wording there, the employer's representative gives the contractor a change order. That is the wording directly out of the schedule. Where we have put in 2 columns, DE and CE, that means if you have an entitlement, you can claim a delay event, and CE, you can claim a compensation event. Now, as I said, there are 21 of these. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to go through maybe 6 or 7, which are the ones that are most impacting on employers, and the ones that they have the ability to control and thus reduce the risk. Okay. On the very far column on the right hand side, we've then explained what these include. For example, change orders. These are variations where you instruct additional work as the employer, etc. Or you may instruct less work. You may change substitute materials. You may change the timing of the work and when it's going to be done, or the sequencing. This all comes down to a compensation event. Now, how do we mitigate this? And this is my greatest bugbear when I'm talking to employers. The way to mitigate against change orders, or what you or I would call variations under other contracts, is a comprehensive design. You've seen there, we said avoidance and mitigation measures, comprehensive design and specification at tender stage. There is no excuse not to have a complete design. Okay, designs need to be 90% complete when you go to tender. There are very high profile projects in Ireland going on at the moment that were tendered at 30-35%, and they are in a nightmare scenario. Okay, so for you as the employer to control, spend the additional money, get the design correct, make sure it's consistent with the specification, or there's consistency between the spec and drawings, and that the scope is very, very clear to the contractor. There's no room to maneuver. Okay, it's always impossible to design it out completely, but certainly this is what you need to be doing. There may be value engineering where you look at alternatives to reduce the potential costs. That is absolutely a valid way to go. But again, record it and make sure it's incorporated into the contract documents. But as we go through these, it all comes down to the prep work of the design. That's where the biggest hit is taken by employers. And we see this acting for contractors. For us, it's the biggest avenue to go after additional fees, after additional costs for a contractor. On the employer side, we defend these all the time because there's a consistent weakness. We have seen, we would do a lot of work in the UK as well, and we see here and in the UK, what's creeping into design at the moment is, please, the architect or the engineer would put in, please construct to manufacturer's design or his details. Lazy design. That is lazy design. And as the conciliator myself and as an adjudicator, if I'm sitting and I have two parties in front of me and they're submitting arguments and there's an issue around the design and there's an unfair transfer of design by the employer, I will fall in favour of the contractor. That's just the reality. And most of the colleagues in my game will say the same. So make sure the design is done properly. It's thorough. There's not shortcuts, refer to this, refer to that. The contractor's not a designer. I take the view that my father took. I'm a stupid contractor. You tell me how to build this, please. So it is in your interests to ensure the design is as finished, as frozen, as complete as it can be. Okay, so as I say, if you learn nothing else from today, please learn your contract sum is only as comfortable to you and anti-risk. It's how good is the design. That's what it comes down to eventually. How good is the design? Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm skipping number 2. There's 21 of these. Please feel free to go through them, but I'm just looking at the ones that do cause issues. Number 3, the ER directs the contractor to suspend works under clause 9.2. Again, the advice on that is you avoid this at all costs, and it's an absolute must, because this is, once you suspend the works, the contractor falls into recovery straight away on money and time. So it's going to cost the employer and it endangers your budgets. So suspend as little as possible. If there's an issue on a site, try and isolate that section of the site and make the rest of it available. Suspension costs money, and we see that, particularly during COVID, it became a bit of a free-for-all. Okay, but even after COVID now, because people have learned lessons about suspension, as soon as the suspension, they're straight in for their costs. So just be aware of that. You should try and minimise sort of events of suspension. Number 5 on the next slide, please. There's a factual error in information about the site or setting out information. Okay, this goes back to the very first one. Again, incomplete design. If there's the opportunity to undertake surveys, soil investigation, site investigation, securing as-built drawings, securing historical maps, secure them. I have worked on projects, road projects in Ireland and in the UK, where had £250,000 or euros been spent on site investigation pre-tender, it would have saved tens of millions in claims thereafter. That's the reality. That's the factoring. That's how it works. If you don't design properly, or if there are unknowns, you are exposing the employer to additional costs. So for those who are providing funding, my advice would be, like, we worked on a road project, a bypass in Munster some years back, and the design engineer acting for the employer asked for €350,000. And we found this out in arbitration because we had discovery of documents when it went into dispute. They asked for €350,000 to do proper site investigation down this road, where it was known there was rock profile, there was changing geological ground conditions, there was bog area, there was marsh. It was a real issue. They were given 70 grand. 70 grand they were given. It was a completely they may as well give them nothing. And that project did end up becoming a major arbitration. So what I'm saying to you is, please don't be stingy at the start of a project. The more money you spend front up, believe me, you will save it in multiples further down the line. You have people like me looking at documents, looking at geological profiles, saying this wasn't picked up. We can go at this against the employer. So it's in your interests to spend extra money to make sure that all utilities that are in the area are known about, that you can flag them, that you can do you've done some site investigations of the area, and enough that it gives a fair reflection of the ground. And that then gives the contractor less maneuverability to claim extra money, but it also makes it easy for him. He knows what he's vulnerable to. He knows what he has to price. There are less unknowns. So between design and background information, I would say to you, it is worth spending the money to get it right and to get it as close to conclusion as you can. It just takes so much risk off the table. Next slide, please. Okay, number 7 and number 9 on the following slide are the same items, really. Under clause of 4.11, a contractor can ask for information from the employer. They're usually done by way of an RFI, request for information during the course of contract. The more complete your design is, the less RFIs are raised. That's just a fact. Okay, because there's less questions to be asked, there's less angles to be looking at. Under clause 411, if a contractor asks for information, the employer is supposed to come back within 10 days with an answer. Invariably, they don't in most cases. So the way to mitigate this, to protect the employer, is to make sure that you have robust project management on the project. That there are schedules of this, there's a register, it's reviewed and it's maintained and updated as quickly as possible. It becomes very difficult on projects where there are multiple elements going on. You could have the ER, the employer's representative, which is the same as the project management under the NEC4. The employer's representative could have 20 people under him. He could have electrical engineers, structural engineers, civil engineers, architect, mech-and-elec, fire consultants, etc. All of these could be getting RFIs. These need to be responded to. If they're not responded to in time, the contractor is entitled to time and money. It's both a compensation event and a delay event. I go back to my very early point. If the design is well developed, taken to as close to a conclusion as it can be, not always possible, I'd accept that. If it is, then there's less likelihood that RFIs will be raised. Okay, and we all have dealt with contractors. I've been against them and I've been on the side where they bury the ER, the employer's representative, in RFIs to make a claim. So again, the cleaner the design is, the more complete it is, the more consistent it is with specifications, between specifications and drawings, the less elbow room there is for a contractor to try and come in doing claims, and thus sort of undermine or putting more risk on the employer as regards the budget. Okay, if we can go on to number 13, I think it's next page down. Yes, a weather event. We all know what a weather event is. It's in sort of my contract parlance, it's called a neutral event. This is an example where the employer, if the contractor is delayed, the employer, if he agrees with that and he assesses it, he does give time, he does award time to the contractor, but the contractor gets no recompense. There is no compensation for this. It's a neutral event, it's weather, it's no one's fault. It's neither the employer's fault, nor is it the contractor's fault. Now, I will say, I have on occasion claimed money for this on the basis that because, for example, there was a delay during a project that was down to lack of design, it pushed certain weather-sensitive activities like earthworks into the wetter season, and therefore it costs more money. It's not just a delay event, and I would not claim it under this particular item. I would claim it on one of the other items on the schedule, on schedule 21. Okay, so you have to look at, I suppose, the root of the problem. But from an employer's point of view, this is fine. This gives them time. It's reasonable, but it costs you nothing. Cost you nothing. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, again, I'm not going to discuss this. This is a strike or lockout affecting the construction, or it's delayed to works due to local authority changes. Again, these are, you get time for these, you don't get money. These are just events that the law may change. The employer has no control over that. So he's liable for the time. He has no liability for compensation. So again, he's protected against the budget being undermined. Okay. Item 16, next page. This is probably the most emotive of the compensation delay events. It's where there's a breach by the employer. Contractors are reluctant to use this one unless it's the only avenue, because it is seen to be pointing the finger at the employer, and because the employer is a blue chip client, they don't really want to follow with the local authorities. That's our experience. Okay, but it certainly does allow contractor an avenue to blame the employer and to seek recompense. We've given examples there on the right-hand side of what can happen where perhaps you're hindered on site, you can't gain access, there's unfair interference with the employer's representative, things like this that impact the works the contractor can claim his entitlement. Now, how do you mitigate against this as the employer? You mitigate it by being aware of the contractual obligations. You know what you're obliged to do. I had a call on Monday afternoon from a very well-established employees representative on a project in Dublin, asking me a simple question about how to deal with an extension of time under clause 10 of the government contracts. He should have known that. I had just pointed out the paragraph. It says exactly what's required to be done. He should have known that. So I'm saying how you mitigate against breach by the employers, know what you're aware of. Be aware of it. And therefore you can mitigate it in advance of becoming an issue. It's not always possible, but again, you have to take control of this. You have to grab the nettle and deal with this. Okay. Next item. Item 17. Again, not going to go into detail. This is where there are, but other than to say, this is where there are major differences between the work scope and what's picked up in the pricing document. Okay, it's just it's an element of remeasure, if you like. Next slide, please. Again, the contractor encounters, number 19, the contractor encounters on the site unforeseeable ground conditions. My same comment is there on the bottom right-hand side, avoidance and mitigation. Do not scrimp on paying monies to have proper surveys done and to secure records and to ensure that, that there's much information made available to the contractor as possible to allow him to give a price that's reflective of the work scope that we both agree needs to be done. And that's very important. Next slide. Again, number 21, again, very similar. It's about utilities and finding out what you do when you come upon them. Again, and the delays caused by utility companies. I mean, this is a universal problem. Myself and Leon on a project in London at the moment where the gas utility company, electricity and water, it's an absolute nightmare. The job delayed by 6 months purely because we couldn't get connections. And there was early liaison. But all you can do as the employer is make sure you're engaging with the ESB or with Bord Gáis, etc., or Irish Water, that you're engaging with them early, they know what's happening, they have an idea of the timelines, and to try and work with them to come in line. Again, I've seen projects in Ireland run way over simply because a 10 kVA cable was not moved for 8 or 9 months, and the whole earthworks operations came to a halt. That really shouldn't happen. And the ESB, no one ever takes them to court over it. I can understand why. But from an employer's point of view, I think early liaison is critical. My closing argument, my closing sort of advice on these 21 compensation delay events is as follows. When employers look at these, sometimes they feel aggrieved. This is 21 items upon which a contractor can come after us. And that's the term they use, they can come after us for additional time and additional costs. As a claims consultant, myself and Leon take a different view. These 21 items are giving you, the employer, the heads up of where a contractor can come for additional money and additional time. Therefore, use the opportunity at tender stage to mitigate against these being available. Design completed, specifications completed, proper surveys done, handed over, and as tight as possible on the contract documents. So use this as a tool. You now know these are the only items under which a contractor can claim. So use this to your advantage. Don't see the downside, see the upside. You're getting the heads up. The old forms of contract, the IEI form, FIDIC, they don't specify, so you can claim anything. This limits to 21 number items under which they can claim as a compensation and or a delay event. So manage that. Manage it at the tender stage. As I've explained during the discussion, manage it during the course of the contract as well. Next slide, please. Following up, prior to COVID, there was no real PVC clause under the contract, price variation clause under the public works contract. It was there, but the bar was so high. In all my time having done claims, I don't think we ever successfully got a PVC claim. That changed with the unfortunate happening of COVID. There's now clause 15 inserted, and the government have now, under government contracts, they've now inserted a clause where reasonably contractors can recover additional costs in respect of price fluctuations or changes in law for labour, materials, fuel, and plant. There is a drop-down table in the schedule, and it allows between, I think, 2 and 8%, or maybe 2 and 10%. Here we've just shown us 5%, and that sets the threshold. And it's worked off the CSO, the Central Statistics Office here in Ireland. They're in the state of the baseline. That data is picked by the contractor, so you now have a mechanism through which you can secure PVC and price variation monies. Okay, and rightly so. The older versions of the contracts were very unforgiving, and you need to be on site for years before you could even contemplate applying for additional monies. I don't think in my time, Leon, I don't recall we ever getting PVC money prior to COVID on any of these contracts. It's very, very difficult. Again, there are very good workbooks available online. You can tap onto construction procurement price variation. Very good Excel sheets there. Very workable, user-friendly. It's a tool for the employer. It's also a tool for the contractor. In respect of this particular clause, my advice to you to mitigate would be take control of this. If it's becoming apparent that fluctuations in prices are occurring that are going to result in additional payment, use these schedules. Don't be waiting for the contracts to come to you. Use them. Be aware of your exposure. Again, when a contractor, and believe me, as someone who acts for contractors, when I see an ER doing that, I'm thinking, this guy's in control of this. There's going to be no messing here. We need to get this right. And that's to your benefit. So my argument always would be, for this price fluctuation clause, the employer's representative and the employer should take control of this. That is your way of mitigating. Next slide will be, okay.
Do you want to just mention about the NEC contract, about the X1 clause, Dave?
Oh yes, apologies. Yes, I do. Apologies. Yes, well spotted. Yeah. This clause is very similar to the NEC4 secondary option clause X1 of the NEC form. So it is. So it's brought the public works contract in line with the NEC, which is very useful. So those of you familiar with the NEC4, this will be nothing new to you. Okay. Thank you. Okay. The summary of the main causes of sort of what we will see as project modifications, incomplete design. I cannot hammer that home enough. Okay, verging on being boring. It is a major problem, and it's not just in Ireland. Every jurisdiction. We're involved in arbitration in New York at the moment. Exactly the same thing. Incomplete design. You're not hiding to nothing. It's just open doors for people like me acting for the contractor. Number two, pricing documents. Pricing documents need to be correct. They need to be prepared by properly qualified quantity surveying companies. They need to be prepared. This is under the public works contract. They need to be prepared in accordance with the relevant methods of measurement, be it CESM, Civil Engineering Standard Method of Measurement, or ARM4, Agreed Rules of Measurement, or NRM2 in the UK. They need to be properly complied. Again, if they are not, if there's omissions, if there's errors in descriptions, it's an avenue. It's a risk to the employer that the contractor can come at you looking for more money. Ground conditions encountered, I've explained that and how to mitigate it. Proper surveys, spend that extra bit of money at the start to avoid multiple payouts later on. Utility providers, your only control on that really is early liaison, and hopefully they'll come on board, because utility providers are, in my experience over the years, are laws themselves, but early liaison is certainly advisable. Other employer contractors on site can be an issue. Again, it's all about consultation. Give the contractor plenty of notice, even in the tender documents, that there are going to be employers contractors on site. When it does come to happen, make sure that they're given plenty of notice, safe passes are in place, that there's respect, mutual respect and cooperation on the site. It's so important, okay? Because it can be difficult. Subcontractor cash flow, again, this is where subcontractors end up putting in claims that are passed on to contractors, passed up the line because of late payments, etc. You're a blue chip organisation. Government bodies are blue chip. There should be no reason why there should be late payments to contractors, which then feed down to subcontractors. Okay. Next, please. Okay. One of the main items introduced by way of the public works contracts back in 2008 was the introduction of conciliation. And it's like a mediation, but it's got a bit more steroid pumped into it. It allows a conciliator to write a recommendation at the end of a 2-day session or of submissions from either side. The recommendation doesn't have to be accepted, it can be rejected, but it just means they feel the benefit of having a third party looking at it. I'm a standing conciliator on a number of projects, and it does help that at the early days you can say, look, Mr. Contractor, this is what I think you're probably entitled to if I was looking at this as an adjudicator, and Mr. Employer, you are a little bit exposed here. And very often, I would say 95% of the time, deals are done, and it does work conciliate. Now, there is this big boast in Ireland that we're the only country in the world use it. Rubbish. We've used it in the Zurich High Court in Switzerland. They use Conciliation Plus, but it is a really, really good system. I haven't seen it used in the UK, but it is a very good process because it's not as abrasive as adjudication. And in Ireland, I'm only aware of one contractor who has taken a step of taking an adjudication against the government, and that's on a huge high-profile project here, and it was done just to release a smack on the wrist. Okay, it's not done because seeing that you could damage your relationship with a local authority, or if you do not have housing works for local authorities, you don't want to follow with them. Adjudication will certainly be a black mark against you. So it's normally conciliation is the way it works. Now, The new contracts prior to conciliation have introduced what they call a project board, and it's where both sides name some senior management level. So if it doesn't get fixed on site between the commercial managers and the quantity surveyors, between the employer and the contractor, it's elevated up to the project board. And there you might have the group commercial director and someone of seniority, of senior level on the local authority side, and they will sit down, perhaps with a standing conciliator, they're the three of them, they bang their heads together and they try and close it out. It's, again, very successful process. So project board process, conciliation, you can go to adjudication, very few people do. Arbitration is the means of appealing the conciliation if both parties can't agree on the recommendation. I would never recommend arbitration. We're involved in some horrendously expensive, horrendously slow. Conciliation does work. There are also procedures available, obviously, in Northern Ireland. I understand it's negotiation, mediation, conciliation. NEC again facilitates the introduction of different ways of ADR, alternative dispute resolution. As a process, it does work. So really that concludes it. Other than to say, design as complete as possible. That is the best way to protect you as the employer against the fluctuations on the contract prices and the funding. Thank you very much.
That's great, thank you. We'll now move on to the question and answers.
Thank you very much to the three of you. That was really, really informative, and I hope all of our participants got a lot out of that as well. To date, we only have 3 questions that have come through the Q&A, but I'm sure there will be others starting to come through as well. So if we start with the 3 questions we have. So the first one is, if a works tender is published as an open procurement on etenders.ie, does this meet the requirements? Contact value of 250,000 to 550,000 euro. Do you need me to read that again?
Yes, maybe so. If you wouldn't mind, Marianne, please.
If a works tender is published as an open procurement on etenders.ie, does this meet the requirements? The contract value is between 250,000 euro and 550,000 euro.
Yes, if it's a cross-border project, it also needs to be advertised in Northern Ireland as well. But the fact that it's below the EU threshold, yes, the procurement portals can be used, but you need to make sure you're advertising on a cross-border basis.
Great, thank you, Emma. If the tender comes in above the available budget, can the authority discuss with the lowest compliant tender to get a project within budget?
Dave or Leon, can you maybe answer that?
Generally not. Dave, did you have?
No, I would say generally not.
Yes.
Is my experience. If the budget isn't there, the budget's not there. That's certainly my experience here.
Okay.
Yes.
And the third. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Emma.
No, I was just going to say yes in that case, because you already have done your specification, so you've got your tenders in for that. So if you then can't, you would then have to go through then a process of can they go do value engineering? No, to be able to look at the specification, reduce that, or is it then having to go back to the drawing board and do a new specification and go back to the market again?
Okay, what I would say in that regard, I have seen value engineering done. Okay, where it does bring it below the budget when there's on a public contract. I have seen then other contracts object that, say they should be given the same opportunity. So I have seen it done quietly, and the project has then progressed. I would say no more than that. But it is a bit of a grey area, is my take on it. Leon?
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, value engineering is the way, absolutely. But it's just there's an issue: is are you not giving everyone a fair crack of the whip? Then, if there's 3 people tendered, why are you just picking the lowest, giving him the chance? Perhaps the other guys could have come up with some value engineering. It can be muddy if one of the contractors gets annoyed about this. That's all I'd say.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the principle that we would go by, is that we need to make sure there's equal opportunity to all bidders.
Yeah,
so that's one of the things we need to be mindful of.
Great, thank you. If we publish a capital works project on etenders.ie, how do we notify etenders NI?
Sorry, Marianne, can I just maybe add a comment to the previous question? That
Of
one of the
course,
things as
yes.
well, if
Go
there
ahead,
is
Emma.
any cost overruns, the condition of the letter of offer is that those would be covered by the partner themselves. So you need to make sure then that, and that would then be the partner needs to ensure that they have available resources, that if the value of the contract does come over, does exceed the value of the letter of offer that we have awarded the project, they need to ensure that they can cover those costs. So I just wanted to add that in relation to the previous question. Sorry, Marianne.
No problem at all. So that question, the third one was, if we publish a capital works project on etenders.ie, how do we notify etenders NI?
There's a signposting. I think we'd covered that in the previous general procurement webinar. We will be getting some guidance sort of drafted. I think we were talking to Mike, and we will actually be able to do that. But there is a mechanism that you can publish it. I think it's a pin notice, and then you can basically decide which of the portals you are actually going to use to take the tender response documents in, and the other portal then is just like a signposting saying, pointing to the other portal for the receipt of the tenders. But that is something we are drafting some guidance on that. But the guidance basically, if any of the partners need to know how to do that, we will be circulating that once we have that drafted. But that was the principle, and it always has been the principle that we used in our previous programs as well. That you signpost on one and you accept your bids on the other.
And as Emma says, we are drafting up something with Mike's support, so we'll hopefully have that guidance available soon for you. A couple of other questions that have come through. What do you do if MAT and MEAT do not provide the same winner? Which takes precedent?
Sorry, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I think under the EU regulations, you have to use MEAT. The MAT is the UK current legislation. I'm not sure that's tied down yet, which we do use, but it should be MEAT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that one that we need to come back and clarify, Leon, or does that cover it?
I think that's what Leon has just said. It's just clarified that we need to ensure all projects are implemented in respect of the European directive. So whatever the European directive says regarding procurement, projects should be assessed on that manner. As I said before, that the new Public Procurement Act 23 that has come in place now for the UK or Northern Ireland, it isn't compliant with the EU Public Procurement Directive. So you just need to make sure that you're complying with the EU regulations.
Sorry, Leon is actually correct. It is on the MEAT basis, MEAT, yeah. Also economically advantageous tender. There are talks about changing that, but at the moment that is the position. Okay.
Okay. Can you talk about the requirements around use of existing frameworks, assuming the frameworks were tendered in line with the UK/EU/SEUPB requirements set out?
Yes, an existing framework can be used if I suppose there's certain conditions that need to be met, that the partner is actually named as a user of the framework. The scope of the framework is applicable to the works that you're hoping to do and falls within the scope of the existing framework. The framework has been advertised on the OJU if it's above the EU threshold and it meets all the requirements in relation to the EU regulation, and that there is enough time and available budget left within the framework to ensure that then the piece of work that you want to do can fit within that. And if there's any modifications to that framework duration are all in line with the EU regulations as well. And the other point is that you need to make sure you have access to the procurement documentation relating to the establishment of that framework, because we've found in the past that sometimes that's the thing that if you are a user of the framework but you don't have access to that documentation, and the documentation relating to the establishment of the framework will be required for your controller to examine. I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add to that, Dave or Leon?
No, not at all.
Great, thank you. Does SEUPB need to review tender docs before they are published and review the tender evaluation report prior to a tender is appointed, like the last PEACE programme?
No, there's no requirement. The responsibility lies with the lead partner to make sure they're operating a compliant process, and that documentation then will be reviewed by the controller if it's sampled as part of the risk-based sampling methodology.
Emma, just on a side note, or just something we've noticed creeping in here in the last 12 months, there have been quite a few occasions where tender documents have been pulled together and completely independently, we've been asked to come in and have a look at them just to vet them, just to make sure that, that boxes are ticked and that, I mean, I don't know if I presume that would be the same with yourselves, but that certainly is a possibility. It does work. And we would do a quick check on things like quantities and make sure all the documents are correct and they're aligned and we don't check the design, obviously, and things like that, but just to make sure that they're thorough, they're complete, and all the boxes are ticked. And I think sometimes it's worth doing that for consultants just to independently to come in completely cold and have a look and say, yeah, you're fine, or perhaps you need to change this. It's just, but we've seen a growing number of inquiries in that regard over the last 12 to 18 months.
It's one of the things, I suppose, that we would have in the programme manual, that where you have a capital project, you can utilise the services of CPD to provide that advice. And I know that previously, Marianne, we would have had a similar contract to cover sort of contracting authorities in Ireland. So yes, for my apologies, what I was more talking about was in general terms about our requirement to review tender specifications. But in relation to the capital projects, there is availability, if you're a Northern Ireland contracting authority, to avail of the services of CPD.
Great, thank you. If there is an overspend on the project, does the authority have to notify SEUPB if they fund the overspend?
Sorry, Marianne, would you please repeat that again?
If there is an overspend on the project, does the authority have to notify SEUPB if they fund the overspend?
I think that this is something should be the case officer, the JS case officer should be aware of if they're in liaison with their project. So and I imagine those conversations would come up when they're being monitored. But also, yes, if a project has match funding, we need to make sure that that is being captured, and if it's been captured in the original budget. But those type of conversations should be discussed with the JS case officer, because they are ensuring the project is being implemented.
Great, thank you. There's one more question that has just come through, which we will answer. Will SEUPB be required to approve compensation events, and what is the process for this?
I think that is something we're currently looking at the moment to see if there's a requirement for us to approve them. But definitely, as Dave has already sort of highlighted very firmly, and it's the opinion that we would have, is that the compensation events a project should be minimal, and they have to be unforeseen. There can't be situations where because of a poorly designed project that things are being changed during the implementation, during the build process. But it'll be a conversation first of all to have with the JS case officer, and that's something that they will be monitoring.
Mary, and just on that as well, under the public works contracts now, under the PwC, the employer's representative, which is the equivalent of the project manager under the NEC, has authority to agree compensation payments up to a certain level of his own bat. Just be aware of that. Okay. So he can actually, it might only be €2,000, but he can say, yes, that's a valid compensation event. Okay, that does happen on contracts here under the PwC.
Great, thank you. And this is the last question. In a situation where an existing framework exists and is compliant and was tendered appropriately, this framework rule allows for direct award and call of appointment. Would this direct award approach cause concern or penalties?
Call-off process should be in line with the framework, but again, I think that we've seen instances where it's sometimes can cause concern where there is a direct call off whenever it's unclear maybe how costs will be established. But the general principle about frameworks is that you need to make sure that you, as I said before, you are a user of the framework. There's time within the framework. There's available headroom regarding budgets to undertake the works, and that the documentation is available, and that you're operating in line with the rules of the framework.
Okay. that is all of the questions that we have received. That's us finished. So I just want to say a big thank you to Emma and Dave and Leon for another fantastic session. I hope all of our projects who attended found it useful. As I said at the start, we will be circulating the slide deck, and we will be uploading the recording of this session onto our support portal. And I will let you know when both of those things are available. I'll also be sending you a feedback form as well, and I'd be very grateful if you could complete that. If you do have any further questions that you haven't raised at the session today, please do those through our support portal. We'll be able to pick them up from there and provide the answers from there. So that will be via the support portal, and the recording will be on the support portal as well. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it useful. We'll look forward to your feedback. Thanks again to our expert panel, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.